nutation. They don't have a good sacral nutation. Does that apply to squatting as well? Because it seems like they'd be good at squatting, but they have to pass through that range of motion to get to 120 degrees for a full squat. So does that apply or is that different?
Yeah, generally you're going to see, like breaking out the pelvic model here, to get to the end range, we obviously need to recounter nutate here. So the degree of nutation to get to the bottom of a squat and pass through that internal rotation, like a lot of people, like you'll see this again, like the perfect example of this is like those narrow, younger females, right? They just drop into the squat in a bottom. Like they don't have the control. They just like drop ass to grass. That's what you're seeing, lack of nutation. So I think, at least in my opinion, it's easier to bypass the nutation the nutation for a narrow than it is a wide to bypass the need for counter nutation, because they're just going to butt wink in that instance. And it would be the same thing for a wide in a hinge and a narrow in a hinge. They have the ability to nutate, whereas narrows do not. So they're going to find flexion one joint higher up here.
Cool.
I have two questions about breathing.
Sure.
First one is just I want to make sure I understand the positions correctly. So basically, if we do the assessment and we find, let's say, someone has a hard time putting air into the like anterior upper chest compartment, they have a hard time expanding through their upper ribs. Is it like logical to think that that's when you would use kind of like the inverted position to use gravity to help put air in there without them having to think about it so much?
Definitely. Yeah.
Okay. And then same with like posterior rib expansion, they'd put them in a supine position, oblique, like lateral expansion, putting them on their side. Okay. And I was
putting them on their side, I think would be lateral compression. Does that make sense? Because gravity is going to act down on them and compress them laterally so they can expand from front to back. Whereas if you want posterior expansion, you were right with the supine position. Yeah, that's going to push air down via gravity. If you wanted anterior expansion, I would probably put them in all fours or prone.
Okay, but lateral expansion through the obliques,
supine as well. Because gravity will act down on them and spread them out like a pancake, so to speak.
Okay. Because what I was doing, I was just doing some work with my mom, just kind of running through some of the stuff we're doing, and I was having her like lay on her side and with her inhale, getting her bottom ribs to expand into the floor, and then with her exhale, like when she's getting all the air out, using the oblique to kind of contract to create this tunnel, and thinking about like this like whole contract relax thing. You would recommend just doing it from supine?
I think that brings up a couple of interesting points. So what position were you having her in right there?
Well, I to be honest, I took her through a bunch of different positions, but in that particular one, I had her side lying.
So side lying, like you can't really go wrong with starting someone in side lying, to be honest with you. But I will say that it can be better. The intricacies can sometimes be better through maybe a supine position for these individuals for the reason of gravity, especially a narrow. If you put them in side lying, unless they're heavily compressed, might not be the best position for them right away. Narrows, because assuming they don't have secondary compensations, they need more of that anterior expansion in all fours. Quadruped position is going to be really good for them. But this is bringing me to my second point, that the whole thing with cueing breathing, and this really just comes through reps and doing it a lot. You get to a point where there's so many things going on with these exercises. We're going to talk about some PRI drills next week, just for the purposes of understanding asymmetry. But those drills, and I'm sure we've coached them before, they're really complicated. And there's a lot of things to think about. And that's what your clients will say, like, man, there's a lot going on here. So the more constraints we can give them to get the outcome that we want without them thinking about it, the better. And using gravity to our advantage is one way to do that. Another way to do that is via the reach. So that way they're not having to think, they're just letting the exercise take care of it.
Okay. And then my other question was, Okay, so playing around with this whole idea of like the diaphragm acting as a like one of the main muscles of respiration, but also a main stabilizer. I just kind of feel like I need an understanding of. I just wrote down here like how does the diaphragm act as a stabilizer during an exhale if it relaxes and moves up? Like, yeah.
Think about a powerlifter doing a Valsalva maneuver. So what are they going to do? They're going to basically have the bar on their back and go hold. That's when the diaphragm is acting as a stabilizer right there. So think of, you know, like the diaphragm attachments, they're called crura, but spelled
Yeah.
C-R. So those meaty attachments are going to then stabilize the spine when they're doing a squat, a deadlift, bench press, whatever. But if you notice that they have that anterior attachment on the spine, they're going to pull the spine a little bit forward. But that's also advantageous for a powerlifter because extension is where they get their power. So if you notice, and we'll get into this a little bit more on Monday, there's more attachments on the right. So if it's descended and then it's stabilizing in that instance, and they're going to go into a squat, you're going to see a lot of right hip shifts because the diaphragm attachments are stronger on the right than they are the left. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Cool.
Go.
Anything else?
Can I just say something?
Please.
Okay. So for respiration, right? With inhalation, expansion, and exhalation, compression. So I understand inhalation being external rotation and abduction, and exhalation being internal rotation and adduction. But I don't understand where the flexion and extension comes from. Like flexion and extension, doesn't that have to be like relative to something else, or like, you know, how can in all positions, you know, I'm confused on how exactly that fits into the whole thing, into that whole rule.
Mm-hmm. I look at the pelvis. So that's really the easiest way to visualize this. When we inhale, what happens? This happens. So this is paired with innominate flexion, abduction, and external rotation. But you're right, it's relative to the sacral bone right here. The opposite is happening here with internal rotation, abduction, and extension. And in gait, these things happen together as well. So that's why gait and the limb arc model, they match up so well, because you have that 0 to 60, all those joint actions paired with early stance and then mid stance and then late stance respectively to exhalation and compression. There are instances where, for example, we'll get into this in week 3 with the scapula. The scapula doesn't actually follow that entirely, but it is just relative motion. It's just good to have something where it's like, okay, this is a broad general description of what's happening throughout the body as a whole, but there are exceptions to the rule, the scapula being one of them.
Yeah, so okay, that helps, but still a little bit, because this has confused me ever since I went through PRI Myokin, because it's the same thing. You're talking about the pelvis, and so when we're talking flexion and extension, what am I talking about? What the angle of like the pubis right there, like that is like, because there's so many things moving, right? And again, if you're looking, one angle is opening while one is closing, so that's what I'm saying. Like, who does this just come from, like PRI or something? Like, who chose that we're doing everything in relation to this thing, and that's where because it can be flexion and extension are literally happening at the same time all the time, right?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I really feel this question right now. Yeah. So I'd encourage you, like this, the whole, there's an acronym in kinesiology and physical therapy literature. It's like flexion, abduction, external rotation. It's like, I don't know, but it's been around for a very long time, these joint actions being coupled together. So this is not new. This has been around for literally decades. Now, I believe that when we're referring to flexion, we're referring to this motion right here, right? So when this happens, I believe it is the top bone, ilium, moving on the pubis in terms of flexion there. So I think that is what they're referring to in the pelvis. Now, I think it is, again, just relative to whatever you're trying to describe, but I totally understand what you're saying, but things will make much more sense if you just accept like this is flexion, abduction, external rotation within the pelvis. And then because like as soon as you start to analyze it, you're going to get paralysis by analysis. And then you're just going to be like totally down the rabbit hole. So it's like this is a model and this is a theory, whereas you can create your own and you can have your own description of things. But in terms of how I look at it, this is what we're looking at right here. And then within the rib cage, a similar phenomenon occurs, right? Does that make sense?
Yes.
These things are not new. It's just, this is what we're using to simplify things a little bit.
I have a question, a really, really quick question.
Mhm.
So concerning, circling back to concerning the crua, the diaphragmatic attachments on the anterior portion of the spine, and having more attachments on the right of the spine with our diaphragm, is that what ultimately biases us into internal rotation on the right side of our body?
So yeah, so I think the diaphragm is a main player in it. And then once we get into what makes us asymmetrical, there are other factors as well. Literally just if I cut myself in half vertically and put myself on a scale, my right side would weigh a little bit more than my left. I think that plays into us being pulled over to the right, which then a secondary consequence of that is being an internal rotation. Also, our brain asymmetry plays into that as well, which we'll get into. So I think the diaphragm is probably one of the three most important things, but it's not the only thing.
Okay. Also, another question. So when you're seeing someone's gait, and obviously, you can tell that they are a wide infrasternal angle. However, like when you're watching their gait, their femurs are in, it appears to be an external rotation.
Mhm.
However, like I think we were reviewing that people in who are wide infrasternal angles need external rotation because they're internally rotated. But when you see someone with this like super wide like swing and gait, and they have like this expanded infrasternal angle, I'm just like, what's going on here? Like, is it just appearing that they're in external rotation, or are they actually in external rotation?
You talking about this? Like,
Yeah, sort of. Like,
I'm out like that a little bit. I'm exaggerating so much.
yeah.
Okay, so we've gotten a lot of questions in the Slack chat, and this is like a perfect example of this, of people going like, okay, so I get wides or this and that, but what if blank, right? Those people are compensators. And in week 5, so we're going to go pelvis this upcoming week, rib cage, assessments, compensations. So everything I'm describing to you guys is assuming the baseline, assuming that this is just what you would expect without anything else happening to this person. But the reality is almost everyone you work with will have some degree of a secondary compensation, almost everyone. Like for example, wides are supposed to have more humeral internal rotation than external rotation. I have seen that once in my entire life. And narrows are supposed to have more ER than IR. Again, you often see them restricted in ER just because we're humans and we have compressive tendencies because we're trying to battle gravity. So when you see a wide who has a ton of external rotation like that, oftentimes because they're biased towards this, which allows them to pick up IR, they're going to have compression on the backside of their pelvis, which then pulls them back, restricts IR, and helps them pick up ER. That's a secondary compensation.
Yo.
What other questions do we have? These are great questions, by the way.
I have a question, Connor. Just I went through the Lindmark model there today, and I done the the assessments that were towards the end. Now I would be a narrow infrasternal angle. So when I done like the squat test and pulling the knees up towards the chest, like I can just about get past 90 degrees. And then I start to stick. Now when I do the toe touch, like I can easily touch my toes, but the straight leg raise is just terrible.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering what's kind of going on.
What's your squat look like?
It's good until like maybe 100 degrees, maybe, and then I go into butt wink.
So I think you're a pretty cut and dry case of someone who is going into a secondary compensation as a narrow, right? So with narrows, what you often see, and again, we're going to get into much more detail with this, the narrows are here, they get pushed via back extensors. So if you guys watch that video I said about the relative versus absolute orientation of the pelvis, their pelvis gets pushed forward as an absolute unit, which helps them pick up internal rotation, but restricts external rotation capabilities. But you're still counter-nutated, more so than you are nutated relative to what's going on within this structure right here. So you can still, that's why you see narrows like, I won't get into the PRI terminology, but that's why you see narrows who can squat to past 90. They can get into a relatively deeper squat than someone like me who has a very hingy squat, because they still have a little bit of access to that counter nutation, but they've lost the ability to go full ass to grass because of this pushing forward, usually of the back extensors. That's not the only thing that can happen, but I would say it's definitely the most common. That's why you see a lot of girls who have this sort of orientation right here, but their back is still pretty flat. It's because they started with a flat back, and then that secondary back extensor pushes them forward. So I believe that without having assessed you or looking at you, that's probably what's going on with you. And how many degrees is your straight leg raise, would you say?
It's like 80, I'd say, if even.
80?
Yeah.
That's not bad. I would say like that's pretty acceptable. That would not be a big red flag for me, but I would imagine that because you're probably pushed forward like this, that's going to change what happens when you lay on the table. So if I'm starting here and I get to 80 degrees, then I was really starting in like, you know, if I was starting in 15 degrees, then that's going to matter for my assessment. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, just one kind of question: would you say a lot of this stuff would apply to youth athletes?
Yeah. Youth athletes they're a gift and a curse to some degree. But what do you mean in terms of like how this would apply, like the assessment process, like these principles we're talking about?
Yeah.
So they're still, they're humans. So they have a tendency to be very, like visually, these things are very common in youth athletes because they haven't learned, they don't have like the motor programming to kind of like hide it yet. So it's kind of cool to just like watch a youth athlete move. But the good thing is they're so pliable. I've honestly, all this stuff we're talking about with youth athletes, I don't really do it with, because one, it's way too complicated for them to like consciously process them. And two, it's so boring. It's so boring to them. The only time this stuff is like the most effective it can possibly be is when someone is like, I need this. That's when I'm going to have someone lay on the floor. That's when I'm going to have someone do these very complex things, because I know that they're going to buy into it. But if someone isn't really into it, then I'm not going to give them, breathing drills. I'm going to have them do more weight room stuff. Youth athletes, like for example, I had a youth athlete a month ago who had no internal rotation. He was a narrow. So I just got him on the ground and did like those 90-90 switches with him. He got like half of it back in 2 sets. And that just goes to show how pliable they are. So really, like, this stuff is great and it helps you get an understanding to where they are, but we don't need to overcomplicate things with them, I think.
Thanks.
Going off of that question, do you have any recommendations in terms of like, I mean, I'm sure this will progress as we move along through this course, but kind of initial buy-in for any clients? I just have a few who I know that if I put them, side-lying 90-90 breathing, it would be a game changer, but they just don't. They're like, why can I just lift weights?
Sure.
So I just wanted to hear.
For sure. So find what they care about. If it's squatting deeper, lifting more, a lot of times these people are, I don't need this, I'm just going to stretch. So I'll be like, all right, I'm going to measure you right now. Go stretch. All right, come back. How much did that help you? All right, now let's go do something that I think is probably better for you, and then come back and measure. And then if they argue with an objective result, then I don't really know what to tell you. But something that you can also do is, for example, someone really cares about improving their squat. Give them something that is going to give them a deeper squat right away, and then be like, that's going to give you some credibility. You know what I mean? So just like find what they care about and then assess them, show them an objective, better result. And then that's going to go a really long way.
Connor,
Mm-hmm.
why are we using these models that describe what a wide needs or a narrow when you know that in most cases it won't be that way?
So why are we going over like this stuff when most people are compensators? That's what you're saying?
For me, right now, or what I did before this is I assess, I see limitations, and I go and try to correct the limitations.
Yeah.
But now it's like I'm correcting something that shouldn't be happening. So it's like it gets confusing.
For sure, man. That's an extremely valid question. I'm gonna give you guys the whole course, the whole 12 weeks in like a sentence. So the reason why we're learning this stuff is because our whole goal, the whole scheme here is to find out where someone is and then give them what they should have and then give them what they need. So to make that a little bit more easy to understand. So if I'm a wide, I'm missing IR and I have a ton of ER, I want to give myself IR and then I want to restore ER. If I'm a narrow and I'm missing a ton of ER, I want to give myself that because that's what I should have, because secondary compensations are bigger muscles closer to the surface. Our wide ISAs and narrow ISAs, our left AICs, whatever, they're deep. They're like who we are genetically. Those are those deep muscles, smaller muscles, deeper within our body. However, we use our lats, our pecs, our quads, our glutes. We use those muscles as compensators to manage gravity and the demands that are placed on our life. So we want to get rid of those. We want to get those guys to shut down. And then we can address the underlying issue to restore variability. So we want to know where someone is. So for example, James, he's a narrow, but he's become more compressed. So I want to give him the ER he should have back first, and then we can go give him some IR. Does that make sense? That's why we're spending so much time with this. Like, this is where we should be, because that's going to be important for determining what we do first. What's up, Ben?
Yeah, so I just had a few, or really one question about the diaphragm. I found the shorter reading, pages 11 through 21. That was like, that cleared a lot of things up for me and like put a lot of things together. I thought that was really helpful. You know, from like a multifunctional perspective of everything it does. But the more in-depth reading, that was kind of a shit show for me.
Yeah, me too.
For a few reasons. But sort of two of the main things that I wanted to sort of be able to conceptualize were insertional and appositional forces. I couldn't really picture exactly what that was. When I saw apposition, I kept thinking like opposition. So that was just kind of confusing. I was wondering if you could go over those two.
Do you know what a zone of apposition in PRI is?
Yeah.
So for those who might not know, a zone of apposition is basically like the ability for your rib cage, your lower ribs right here, to create this ZOA, because apposition creates opposition. So if this is down, then the air is going to have to go somewhere that's not here. It's going to go on my rib cage. These ribs should rise and externally rotate a little bit, but if they're flared up here, then air is going to follow the path of least resistance because there's no apposition, which creates opposition. So this apposition needs to be here. And I believe that is the language that they're also referring to when they talk about apposition. However, insertional forces, I'd have to go and look at that again because it's been probably 6 months or so since I've read that article. And you're right, it's a crazy one.
Gotcha, yeah.
I have a question. In your answer in response to Raul, you said that, so is wide ISA, are you expecting to be already in internal rotation, or is that something we're trying to achieve and then like external rotation? Or are they like already just favoring internal rotation? I think I'm just a little confused.
Sure. Yeah, so their primary bias Just who they are genetically is internal rotation.
Gotcha.
So if they have way more ER than IR, then you know that that's a secondary compensation.
Got it.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
Yes. I have a question about the limb arc model as well, but similar because it's back to the whole inhalation exhalation thing that I guess. So again, if I'm looking at it just from the like, it's a model. So is there, well, I guess, does it actually have to do with inhalation, exhalation then at that? But like when you're talking about the squat, right? So like at this point, your inhalation, this point, exhalation, this point, inhalation again. But like, that's not really how you're breathing through a squat, right? So like that's where I'm like, it's just that we're just like that's just the name of the pattern we're moving towards. Like I don't know, I'm just confused in that whole thing. Like
the representation of 0 to 60, 60, 120, 120, 180. Those are called inhalation and exhalation to help you guys get a visual for what's happening biomechanically within the pelvis as it relates to inhalation and exhalation. So when I'm here, 0 to 60, and this is like a broad general range, because again, for other people, it could be like 53 degrees, other people 68 degrees, you know what I mean? So it's like, it's gonna vary, but 0 to 60 is a general rule. So this is what happens when we inhale. This is what happens from 0 to 60. This is what happens when we exhale. This is what happens from 60 to 120. And then again, beyond 120.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Cool. You guys want to go over the study guide, or do we have any more questions?
I had a question real quick.
Go ahead, Ryan. Yeah.
So with the ISA, I mean, I think you said that normal should be around 110. Is there like a normal range in addition to wide and narrow? Is there like a middle portion that we should be looking at? If we see those people, do we assess them differently, or do we like, you know, lift them differently, treat them differently, whatever?
Mm-hmm. So you're saying if someone has like 100-degree ISA,
yeah, like what do we do with them? Are they wide? Are they narrow? Are they just in the middle? Does it matter?
Yeah. So that is a tricky one, and this is what I'll say. Like as you guys get better and better looking at people, you'll just know what people are narrow and what people are wide. You know what I mean? So for example, I look at Amy and I know that she's probably narrow because I know Amy, and also, you know, she's a girl that has more of a narrow frame. So therefore she's probably more narrow. You look at me, I'm wide because I'm a dude. I have a, you know, rounder face and I have a bigger structure. So I'm probably more wide. So you kind of look at someone and that visual cue will tell you probably where they are, but it's not enough. We have to objectively assess. So when we assess the ISA, that's going to be important. But let's say you're like, oh man, I'm really confused. And I also have no idea where they started from because they're like this weird mixture of in between. I would say in that circumstance, I'm almost always going to give them external rotation at first. Because if I give them a ton of internal rotation, they could probably have started from a narrow and compressed into a wide, or they could have been a wide and compressed into a narrow. But generally speaking, if you're really confused, you can't go wrong trying to get some people some ER back first.
Okay, cool.
Because those people will also generally have like a 90-degree supine knee to chest. They'll also probably have a pretty crappy straight leg raise and a pretty crappy squat too.
Okay, so like we basically just go to one or the other the best we can. And then I know you have the secondary compensations on top of that.
Yeah, I would err towards expansion.
Okay, gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
Connor, if I have a wide that has a lot of external rotation, if I try to correct that and give him internal rotation, that will fix the program, or then I will be missing external rotation and have to work on that. So you have seen these changes, or how it works?
So you're saying if you have a wide with a ton of ER and you give them IR, is that going to take away ER?
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes I have seen that. And this is generally what's going on with the wides. They got this compression back here. So if you can get them to open this up a little bit, you will sometimes see them get ER because you're taking them back to where they are. But honestly, I've given wides hip extension a bunch of times because they're compressed, right? And they still have an anterior pelvic tilt. And that goes a really long way. Sagittal plane competency goes so far with so many people just because you're getting them out of this space of generally what is the anterior pelvic tilt. So if you can clear this up, which is what most people have, some people have sway back, some people have other things going on, but just as a general guideline, getting them out of that anterior pelvic tilt, I find, helps them keep a lot of that ER. And if they have like a crazy active knee to chest, then you know that that's probably going to get a little bit better. And if you see someone who has a crazy straight leg raise, then you know that that probably does need to go down, because that's indicative of them starting in a huge anterior pelvic tilt position. So I would say give them some hip, and we'll get into this, give them some hip extension, because that's what they need to have. And also you do see it in some circumstances, but I wouldn't worry too much about it, because it's usually not significant enough for it to make a difference. Anything else?
So with all of this, right, like, I mean, I'm assuming this is something we're going to get into later throughout as the weeks go on or something, but like, then do you, because again, I've never, I know a little bit about like Bill Hartman and his whole stuff, and I've, you know, and so then do you prescribe exercises based on like, you know, people who are more prone to an inhalation or exhalation strategy or something like that? Like, is that how you do your programming?
For sure. Yeah. And we're going to get into that for a whole solid 2 weeks. But yes, I will see where they are and what gaps I'm trying to fill in. And then I will select exercises based off of that for sure.
Yeah.
You guys want to get into the study guide? Let me ask this. How many of you had your small group meeting already? Raul, Corey, okay. So hopefully this will give you guys some good insight, whether you have or haven't. Let me pull it up. But any general questions about the study guide first while I do that? Was anything confusing? Generally speaking, if you can get through this study guide and you can answer it confidently, then you're probably in a pretty good spot. All right. And share screen. Number one, how does a diaphragm function in both respiration and stabilization? I think we answered that to a pretty good degree already, but does anyone have an answer they want to throw out there? We know that when the diaphragm.
So, yeah. Can I try?
Yes.
This is just me thinking out loud. I'm literally trying to think through this as so. One, the diaphragm, so on inhalation, creates intra-abdominal pressure that will help stabilize the lumbar spine through outward pressure onto the core, the abdominal walls, the low back, up and down to the two diaphragms. And then there's also the attachment sites of the diaphragm onto the spine and rib cage. So when the diaphragm pulls, it tightens that as well, I guess, in that it pulls the spine forward and the ribs down. Is that how it works?
So when we inhale, think about the slides. Do you remember the slide where we talked about inhalation and exhalation?
Sure, I have it right here.
Yes. In fact, that would probably be good for me to pull up right about now. Let's go here. So these are the joint actions that are associated with inhalation. Upper cervical extension, lower cervical flexion. Thoracic kyphosis decreases overall, and counternutation of the sacrum. So if you look at this dude on the right here, that's generally what's going on. Now, there is an argument to be made that different parts of the thorax go into more flexion, different parts of the thorax go into more extension. And I think that's getting into the weeds, but overall the thoracic kyphosis is going to decrease overall. That's why you see narrows that are biased towards inhalation have that more flat spine. So does this help you kind of visualize a little bit better, Paul?
Well, yeah. So, that's what I'm saying. I understand the intra-abdominal pressure part, right? I get that, as it pushes down, it closes that, the air pushes out. Yeah, sure. But yeah, that's why I'm the attachment sites. So as the diaphragm domes down, right, that causes it, like if it's shaped like this, yeah, before I inhale makes it go like this. But at which point is it pulling on the attachment? It does the, like, I get that the pressure goes down this way, yeah, either like as I, but then at what point is this pulling on the spine? Is it when I go down or when it comes kind of back up into its original shape? Does that
In
make
the
sense?
distension, because for the same exact reasons of when we inhale and hold that breath, then we have that stabilization happening. And that's when, you know, for example, that power lifter is going to be holding that. That's when those GRU attachments are going to fire. Oops. And then that answers the second part of it. How does it function in stabilization, right?
Yeah.
So we see that a lot, and we're going to get into how the diaphragm is asymmetrical next week. So I'll leave that for at that point. But I just want to make sure you guys understand the very basic function of it. Why is every muscle considered triplanar?
Because nothing acts in isolation and everything is expanding and contracting in a rotational manner at all times. Muscles, ligaments, and tendons work as a tension network of cables. And they are designed to efficiently redistribute stress among the entire system.
Yeah. So even joints, like we think of joints doing like a hinge action like this, but like the knee, for example, the femur when we lock out our knee, the femur goes into relative amounts of internal rotation, tibia goes into relative amounts of external rotation. The opposite happens when we unlock our knee. Femur goes into ER, tibia into IR. These are small relative movements, but it's this, right? That's even within our bones. So our muscles have to follow suit and then expand and contract. How does inhalation and exhalation affect the diaphragm, sacrum, and pelvic innominate bones? We've kind of hit this already, but I'd love to hear someone summarize it other than myself.
During inhalation, the diaphragm descends, the sacrum nutates, and then the pelvic expands. And the opposite with exhalation.
So the sacrum is going to counter nutate on inhalation, right? Exhalation, yes, the sacrum nutates.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I think that's what you meant to say. Yeah. Okay, what about exhalation? What are the joint actions going on within the pelvis? And what is the joint action? What is nutation? Is that extension or flexion of the sacrum?
Nutation is flexion,
right.
Contornutation extension.
Right. And then the pelvis goes into IR, extension, adduction. Why is a wide infrasternal? Do you have another point, Raul?
No, it's fine.
Counternutation is extension.
Correct. Why is a wide ISA biased towards pelvic ribcage joint actions, compression joint actions, and why is a narrow ISA biased towards pelvic ribcage inhalation joint actions? You can take that a couple of different ways. It's kind of an open-ended one. So why is there underlying genetic predisposition biasing wides towards IR and narrows towards ER?
For me, here it gets confusing because someone who is biased inhalation, who is compressed, presents a rib positioning that is like an inhalation, right? So it's kind of the opposite. So I don't understand why it's happening. I guess it's like a secondary compensation, but.
So narrow. Well, before I say that, I don't want to do all the talking. Does anyone else have a thought or a point?
It's kind of counterintuitive. Like if we are thinking about exhalation, excuse me. No, I forgot my question.
All good.
It's ran out of my head.
Happens to me all the time. So A wide is biased towards what we call compression because this individual, think about their ISA, right? So what happens when we have a very compressed posterior rib cage, right? This is like what makes up this individual, right? They have a diaphragm that is descended first and foremost. So their diaphragm's descended, right? It's acting as more of a stabilizer, so it's pulling their spine forward. And then that results in compression within the posterior rib cage. So when I'm here, just like a powerlifter, when I breathe in, everything's going here. So that widens out my ISA more and more. When that happens, you have the pelvis sacrum nutation. And then when that happens, you have that compression, IR, extension, adduction. Narrows have an especially descended diaphragm. This is where it can get a little bit confusing. But thanks to that really easy to read article earlier, we understand that the pressure gradient changes within the thorax. And then the diaphragm gets sucked inward and upward due to that change in the pressure gradient because that individual is in an inhalated state. Their scaps are in an inhalated state. Their posterior rib cage is in an inhalated state because they're trying to find inhalation somewhere. But they then need to exhale. They need to find an exhalation strategy. They need to find some way to ascend this extremely descended diaphragm. So what they do is through that change in pressure within their thorax, they compress that infrasternal angle together. Their external obliques, their obliques in general, just start to compress them more and more as they try to find an exhalation strategy. And this further assists in the compression that they have in the anterior rib cage. But their posterior rib cage, their posterior mediastinum. If you guys have ever seen a picture of the posterior mediastinum, let me pull that for you. Look at this picture right here. Look at how much more massive this cavity is than the anterior mediastinum. So the reason why we call narrows an inhalated state is because they have more access to this inhalation than a wide does. A wide's got this to work with. So that's why if you're going to put someone on the spectrum or the other, we're going to put narrows in the inhalated state because not only is their pelvis representing a more inhalated state, but they have access to this posterior mediastinum more so than a wide would. Hopefully that helps.
So when you say an inhalated state, you mean like open ribs, closed thoracic?
So we're saying open posterior ribs, closed anterior ribs. And then you could say hand in the back. You could say closed. You know what I mean? So just posterior. Wides, posterior shut down, anterior open. But their pelvis is represented that state of inhalation. And also their spine.
I'm a little there, but I'm getting there.
What else can I do to help you understand? What's the hand?
No, I'm just trying to to picture it all together, everything like moving in one system, you know.
For sure. And if you have any other questions later on, just throw them in the Slack chat and I'd be happy to help. But think about just inhalation, right? What happens, our back gets more flat, that's a narrow, when we exhale, spinal curves increase, more of a wide too. That's another way to look at it. Why would someone's knees want to cave in during the sticking point of a squat at around 90 degrees of hip flexion? For those of you that are unfamiliar, when someone does have that knee valgus action, it does occur around that 90 degrees. You also see it a lot with jumping. Any thoughts?
Maybe we'll be biased more towards exhalation and compression, so it comes with extension, adduction, internal rotation.
That could be one reason, but
like the adductors are more mechanically advantaged this position to extend the hip. Am I right? No?
I see what you're saying. And I think that's I like that you said that, because that's a piece of the puzzle, but I think we can go deeper.
I would say the opposite. In that if you have someone, let's say, like, who's your archetypal narrow, who has no layers of compensation, someone who has like 1,000,000 degrees of ER, none IR, what they'll do when they get that sort of 90-degree compressive propulsion arc range is just go knock knees because they can't authentically actually internally rotate to compress.
Couldn't have said it better myself. What about a wide, which is I think more what Tomer was saying. Am I saying that right? Is it Tomer?
Yeah.
Why would a wide have a knee valgus?
I think a wide might have more of a valgus because, like Tomer said, they might already be existing in this super anteriorly tilted position, which a lot of times I know with like powerlifters that I work with, if they can't pull their pelvis underneath themselves, they don't really have leverage from the glutes to extend the hips. So the adductors will become the primary hip extensor in that case, which a lot of times will just yank the knee in and the foot along with it.
Yeah. And if they have secondary compensations, what you'll often see is something similar. So that's well said, man. Well said. Something else. Does anyone know how this relates to the pelvic floor? This is a little bonus.
Can we repeat the process, why it happened again?
So, okay, just to clarify quickly, a narrow, they're here, right? ER. So they struggle to find that mutation in IR that we talked about. So they might do this knock knees, and this is going to go into the pelvic floor a little bit. Look at what happens when your pelvic floor is here. When we compress and produce force, we need to do this. So they might knock their knees together because they can't authentically find that internal rotation, which also helps them ascend their pelvic floor and produce force. A wide generally is going to have a secondary compensation where they're going to have compression back here, limiting their internal rotation. So they're going to use other muscles and other strategies to help them find that missing internal rotation as well. And also what you see with people who have a knee valgus on something like, for example, a jump. What they often do is you might see, like Robert Griffin III is a perfect example of this. Did anyone ever watch RG3 jump? There's a big thing on like Sports Center, everything like this dude's going to hurt himself. His knees are caving in all the time, which, yeah, okay, but like there's more to it. If you have knee valgus that's coupled with femoral internal rotation, tibial internal rotation, and also pronation at the foot, it's probably not the worst thing ever. But if you have all these sort of janky things going on, like femoral internal rotation, tibial external rotation, then some wonky pronation, you're probably going to have an issue. And with that instance, what you see is someone who is real compressed like this, and then they can't descend their pelvic floor. They can't absorb force. So what they do is they absorb force at their knees. So their knees come in together because that is going to absorb the force because their pelvis cannot do it. It's just like a squat or a deadlift. You can't flex your sacrum, you're going to flex your upper back. You can't counter nutate, you're going to make your whole pelvis counter nutate. So it's just, again, it's like the joint by joint approach, right? If you don't have it somewhere, you're going to find it one joint up or down. That was a little bit of a tangent. I'm sorry. Does that answer your question, Raul?
Sorry.
Go ahead. So I want to make sure Raul understands. What are you still confused on?
I mean, I think you said so many things, like you presented 3 different cases. So it's not like a general rule. So you will see that happening with different possibilities. That's what you meant?
Yeah. So narrows don't have IR, trying to find IR. Wides have IR. They potentially can't absorb force, so their knees collapse inwards. Or they have a secondary compensation where they lose IR to pick up ER, then they're missing IR, and they're trying to find it.
Cool, thank you.
Okay.
So this is my question. All right. Narrow infrasternal angle, biased toward, so they're sort of biased towards, like, they need more internal, or they need more external rotation. Yes. And however, like they have femoral like anteversion, and when they can't go down to like the sticking point of their knees have valgus at that 90-degree like mid-propulsive like sticking point of the squat. If they already have internal rotation and they're also born, like they also have like this natural like femoral like anteversion, why would their knees still cave if they already are biased towards internal rotation?
Are we talking about wides or narrows here?
Narrows.
So the wides have the bias towards IR, narrows have the bias towards ER.
Okay.
So with that in mind, what would your question be?
Okay, with that in mind, so okay, narrow infrasternal angle, even though they're biased towards external rotation, but they have more like femoral anteversion, and at that sticking point, their knees still like at that sticking point, their knees still cave, even though like their femoral like neck is internally like rotated. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. So you're saying why would someone knee valgus if they already have IR?
Right.
So you do see this, but generally speaking, they're probably not going to have as dramatic of a knee valgus as someone who is completely missing IR and trying to find it. Me, for example, I do this when I squat and the weight gets heavy. I have tons of IR, not a whole lot of ER going on. So I knee valgus because my point of that sticking point of the squat requires relatively more internal rotation than the other points of it. So I am going to knee valgus in together because at that point, I still need to compress more than I already am to lift the weight up, especially when the weight gets heavy, you see this. So that might not be the worst thing ever because I have the internal rotation. It's just like it goes back to that point of if the internal rotation is genuine and I have access to it, I'm not going to be too worried if someone's knees cave in a little bit. But if they don't have IR and their knees cave in, we got a problem.
Thank you. That was a mouthful.
I think we already hit on this one. What are the difference between spinal curves of a narrow and a wide? Anyone want to tackle this?
Connor?
Yes.
Just can I come back to the last question? 1 second.
Please.
So we would say, generally speaking, that a narrow that cave in, if he doesn't have a good internal rotation, could be a bad thing, and a wide could be a good thing because they already have the internal rotation to do that.
Yeah, I would just say, like, to make it general towards all humans, if the knee valgus is not significant and you're seeing it coupled with tibial internal rotation and pronation at the foot, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But if what you see is a knee valgus in an individual that doesn't have internal rotation, and then you see that valgus happening, then we need to have some concern because we know it's compensatory.
Okay.
Who wants to tackle that spinal curves question?
I'll give it a go. So I think that your wides will have a thoracic spine that is generally more kyphotic and a lumbar that is more lordotic than normal. And then the reverse for your narrows. So you'll get that compression or that lordotic curve more so in the thoracic and more of a kyphotic curve in the lordotic spine, or the lumbar spine rather.
Yeah. So just flat back narrow, more spinal curves wide, essentially. All right, last one. We got 5 minutes left here. What is the difference between sacral motion and pelvic orientation? This is one I want you guys to know for sure. We're going to hit it a little bit on Monday as well, but let's talk about it now. Does anyone know the difference between just basically relative motion and pelvic orientation?
I'll try to answer.
Please.
All right, so pelvic orientation would be, we think general of an anterior tilt. So you're starting already pushed into that position. So if my hands are your innominates, they're already in anterior position. Relative motion would be If it's a sacrum moving under or on top of the innominates themselves. So you would start an oriented motion or oriented position and then move relatively from that position.
Yeah. Yeah. Good job, Corey. That was awesome. It just basically relative motion is this kind of stuff, right? Things moving relative to each other. Orientation is this, the thing moving as an absolute unit. As I define it, and people might define it differently, but the way I talk about it, like for the purposes of this course, just think about it like this: orientation, relative motion. All right.
So wait, does sacral motion, wait, that can be irrelevant of the innominates, right? If like just the sacrum can move without these moving, and then that would change the relative position of the pelvis relative to the sacrum. They don't always have to move together.
I think in most cases you're going to see the sacrum moving, and then some degree of the innominate bones responding to that. That's what you see most times, right?
Okay.
So anything that involves this bone moving and then this bone moving with it, that's relative motion, and vice versa. Anytime you see the pelvis orient as an absolute unit, if you guys remember what I talked about probably like 45 minutes ago at this point, a narrow who's here gets pushed forward via back extensors, that is an absolute orientation, at least as I'm talking about it. So hopefully like that's getting the weeds a little bit. I don't want you guys to be too confused by that stuff. Just and that's what's fun about these things. I go on tangents, and then hopefully I don't confuse you guys too much. But essentially, just understand, if you're going to take away anything from this week, understand what the diaphragm does, understand the Limmark model, and understand the very primary things wides and narrows are going to have going on. If you get that under your belt, you're going to be in a really good spot. But this was a lot of fun. I had a good time. I hope you guys did too.
Thank you, Connor.
Yeah, thank you guys. If you have any other questions, throw them in the Slack channel. This will be up on the website within an hour. See you guys later.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
See you guys.